In 1845, a potato blight wiped out the majority of the potato crop in Ireland, causing one of the most deadly times in history and killing over 2 million people. The famine was caused by a disease called late blight that targeted the main food source of the poor, which was potatoes. Many poor Irish farmers worked for the rich, absentee British landowners for low-dollar pay and didn't really have a choice because the British that colonized Ireland forced them to work for almost nothing on their own farming land that was stolen from them and sold to rich absentee landlords so they could farm grains that were not affected by the famine. When the blight hit, the landlords shipped the crops away to Great Britain to be sold so they could get money, leaving the Irish without food. With so many Irish people starving, many were forced to leave their homes, and later, those who remained rebelled against the oppressive British system. The system was very unbeneficial for the Irish, and they were the ones doing all the work. But even though the Irish deserved at least decent pay, and even if a powerful British person wanted to change the system, it was set too far into motion to be stopped unless they put an embargo on food from Ireland. But no one wanted to do that because the Irish meant nothing to the British. Essentially, the British were expendable slaves and they did not need pay because they were not British. The British believed this and continued to believe it because it made them a lot of money. In Daniel O'Connell's The Last Peace speech, February 4th, 1836, he pleaded for anything from the British, but the Irish didn't get any mercy from the British and were left to suffer the full force effects of the famine. The crops that could feed the entirety of Ireland were still being exported to the islands and colonies of Great Britain, and the British just kept exploiting. In their exploitation of the Irish, they took the Irish crops and turned their backs on the Irish when they begged for anything, and just gave them more work in return for very meager food rations that didn't feed the Irish at all, and didn't provide anything necessary like vitamins or nutrients, but that were cheap and they could spare expense for. The Irish were killing each other for food, and according to a study called the Irish Census of 1841, it showed that if there was an embargo on foodstuffs from Ireland, then the death rate would have gone back to normal. But instead they ran out of food, and if anyone else had food, they would do anything to get it. The population was at a mere 6 million back then. To put that in perspective, the current population of Ireland is only 5.6 million. And the population back then, before the famine, was exceeding 8 million and predicted to rise to 9 million, but got chopped to 6 million, and today it is at 5.6 million. If the population had not decreased, then it would have probably been over 10 million, and Ireland would be much more populated and very likely much more powerful. At the start of the famine, when the population was starting to decline and the effects were starting to hit full force, the Irish didn't really blame the British. The Irish didn't blame the British until multiple generations later when they started to make attempts to make reforms. That's when the revolution really began. The generations that were there at the start didn't really fight back, but as it got worse and the British did nothing about the famine, 2 generations later, they got riled up and started to fight back, causing one of the biggest reforms in history, the mass migration from Ireland and the forcing of a global reformation that changed many systems and rules so that the Irish were viewed with more respect. The famine was a very bad event, but it had its upsides. Ireland is now a much more reformed country, and the world is a better society that was in part created by the famine. The reforms that were set then, including America, such as child labor abolition, had many good unexpected upsides that are part of our country today, and that changed many countries with laws that were set in place after the famine and are still here, which means that most everything bad has an upside. Even though the famine had its good parts, there are still 2 million deaths and negligence that made a small country that couldn't support another country its own size support a country much larger than it, and they had to support another country that had multiple colonies larger than themselves, and they didn't have a choice because they were being forced to work. Overall, the famine was a bad event caused by negligence that could have been prevented, but no one wanted to do that, and even though it took a while, the reforms that were put in place for the better back then are still in our society today, showing that even though it was a very bad period, most bad things lead to the reform and the betterment of society, a lesson we can use even today, over 100 years later.